Hi, it is my great pleasure to introduce composer Eliza Brown, whose works have been performed by leading interpreters of new music, including Ensemble Ambiente, Spektral Quartet, Ensemble Recherche, International Contemporary Ensemble, and Network for New Music. She's currently assistant professor of music at DePaul University in Indiana, where she teaches composition and music theory. Eliza holds a Bachelor of Music, summa cum laude, in composition from the University of Michigan and a Doctor of Musical Arts in composition from Northwestern University. Eliza, welcome. It is a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you is if you're aware that this is not the first time that we're going to present one of your pieces. We're interviewing you because Spektral Quartet is performing your first string quartet, but I wanted to know if you're aware that we have performed a piece of yours previously in our season.
I think so. So I think when Del Niente was on tour,
that's right.
Yeah, they brought Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen, so cello and soprano and electronics piece. And I remember them sending me photos of them performing in just the most beautiful concert hall I've ever seen.
It's an amazing place. Yeah, I was wondering if you had been here, because I was traveling at the time, so I actually missed the concert. But now I see that you were not here with them. Well, this is great. I was talking to some of my colleagues this morning about this, because it shows somehow that our season programs talk to each other, that this is not a novelty act that we're putting on together, putting your string quartet, but that it's actually an evolving conversation that we have with a bigger musical world. So first thing I wanted to ask you, I was reading a lot about your pieces, looking at your website, which is quite well organized, and it's a joy to explore, because it's so easy to navigate and to understand where things are coming from. And you write a lot of descriptions about your pieces, and these descriptions are quite thoughtful, and I think they're very enlightening in the way they help the listener understand and enjoy the pieces. And since you have a lot of, not a lot, but some music written for small operas, music theater, also for solo voice, I was wondering if these texts or these descriptions are sketches or kind of scripts or synopsis for the works you write. Do they serve that purpose?
I think they don't serve that purpose before I do the composing. But I think I usually write those, notes afterwards. But they sort of encapsulate like all the thinking I've done in the process of creating the piece. So I tend to think very much in terms of metaphors, extra musical metaphors of various kinds. And so as I'm composing, I'll often make decisions, and the decision might be a technical decision on the surface of it, but the way I got myself to make the decision was to think about it in terms of something else. So I might be imagining an instrument as a character in a dialogue and, thinking like, well, what would this character do at this moment? And so there's a metaphorical basis for the decision that is not sort of purely musical. Sometimes I do make purely musical decisions, and that's fine, but I often end up thinking of them metaphorically after the fact as well. So I think there is this kind of dialogue between sound and discourse in my work that is always sort of ongoing throughout the process, and then winds up in these, sometimes long sort of records of my thoughts, on paper.
But they also relate they go hand in hand with the title. I mean, the title does capture that, and wondering, does the title come before the piece, or does it come afterward?
Almost always after for me, because I think by the time I'm done writing the piece, I know what it's about and I know what it means to me.
That's quite interesting, because out of abstraction you come to something that I think is quite concrete and quite beautiful. Actually, I really enjoyed reading those texts, and they do focus your listening somehow. It's quite a very different exercise from what many other pieces do in general. I also found in those texts that there's certain recurring topics or certain recurring ways of discussing issues, and one of them is what I would call the little man and the big world.
Yeah.
There's this tension between, being able to have a voice about larger issues that affect us and affect the world and affect politics, but somehow knowing that there's a limit to that voice, that voice can only get so far. And there's this, I don't know if to call it a tension or a certain frustration with only being able to play this little role. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a very perceptive reading, I think, of what's going on. I think you're absolutely right that is a theme. Yeah, and I think that comes from a number of different places for me. It certainly is a reflection of sort of my own experience as a human in the world. And I tend to feel really strongly, like when I see injustice or when I see systems that work poorly or hurt people, like I just want them to change so much. There is only so much that one person can do by themselves. And of course, there are many ways one can, organize or work for change or be in solidarity with other people. But even those organizations and relationships, that are working for positive change are themselves fraught in many cases and complex. And, like the struggle is a struggle. So, yeah, I think I'm always kind of negotiating that tension personally, sort of in my own processing of the world and my interactions with it. And I think there is also perhaps, I don't want to ascribe too much to gender, but there's perhaps a sort of gendered experience of the world that's reflected there. I've definitely, like my opera about Juana of Castile has sort of some pretty clear feminist themes to it. And so I am interested in the ways in which, women, people who don't identify as male, have found voices in the world, that puts up obstacles to those voices being heard.
How does that translate into the music you write? I mean, is there a certain soundscape that you create to reflect that? Is there something that we could listen probably in the string quartet that relates to that or not?
I think not really in the string quartet. I think that's about different things. Yeah, and the string quartet is sort of more about like a negotiation with history. There's maybe a sort of gendered element there in the sense that, like, sometimes I think about the history of Western music as sort of something that's like a little bit at arm's length for me, because I know that in most of the historical periods that I've studied, like I wouldn't have been able to be a professional composer. So there's this sense of like communion with those historical eras through study, but also like we have to be realistic about what that period would have been like.
the little woman between the big musical periods, yeah.
So yeah, there's some of that. And I don't think there's a sound associated with it because, again, it's very piece specific, and in each piece I'm constructing different metaphors. And so a different sound world is going to make meaning within itself rather than being some kind of essentialized thing that I could put across different pieces.
It's not a formula, it's a spirit that kind of permeates many of the pieces.
Yeah, or like an exploration within each piece of, how am I going to say this?
Well, I'm glad you talked about the historical context, because that's the other thing reading those descriptions that I found. And there's this also recurring theme, and you may correct me if I'm completely wrong, but there's this very interesting thing about distance between of time, of history, historical distance, geographic distance, and your music being shaping your music also through distancing, like in the piece that was performed here in Bogota, you space out a musical line that Mahler wrote, and that it becomes unrecognizable, but it is there. And there's such a distance that you're suddenly apart from that musical line. So talking about this historical distance, can you talk a little bit about how that gets reflected in music, and what's the anguish that drives that exploration?
Yeah. In a way, I don't... you're absolutely right. There is kind of this theme of distance. And at least in terms of history, I think it's almost more, in my mind, a reflection of reality, in the sense that there are these artifacts from the past that I have a lot of love for, but I can't experience them in their own time and in their own context. So maybe there's like a bit of a grief there. Sort of like these will always be at some remove. So there's that. I also think I'm interested in maybe a sort of melancholy way in the ways in which it's really difficult for people to communicate directly, and that there's sort of always some kind of mediation happening, whether it's the mediation of each other's minds and just how you understand things, or like actual technological mediation. Here we are on video conference. So I think I'm often kind of enacting like these forms of mediation. So where like if there's a sort of concrete object at the heart of a piece, like a musical object, I'm not usually going to just present it up front straightforwardly. It's going to be sort of through a veil or through some filters or stretched out. So there's a bit of this sort of reaching across that I think is a very like human instinct. Like we want to connect, but it's so hard to actually connect. There's so many impediments. And so it's all the more miraculous when there are like these little moments where something comes through and it's like, we understood each other.
How does all this work out when putting together the music, working with ensembles, working with soloists? Is there a lot of talk about this, or, directing a little bit of what the sense of this music might be? Because, I would invite everybody to explore Eliza's webpage, because there are a lot of audios from different pieces. And as I said, unless you read a little bit about it, it's hard to understand sometimes where the music is going, especially if you're listening through headphones and you're not in an acoustical space. But how does that conversation work with musicians in terms of building this, soundscape, spirit, experience?
Sure. Yeah. I don't think that we, in rehearsals, we don't necessarily talk that much about sort of like the secret hidden things. I think it ends up being about sound more than anything else, and just sort of, making this range of timbres and blending and figuring out like what are the gestures when we combine all the parts together, because often the individual parts on their own, you can't just look at your own part and understand the whole gesture. So I think a lot of the rehearsal process is about shaping. And so I guess for me, like as much as I do love sort of the details that I provide in those texts, I think for me, like fundamentally, these are also like sound pieces. They're about sound. And so I think one can listen to them just as a phenomenological experience. So I don't necessarily need people to understand the things that I've written about them. I think one can hear and, read whatever comes to you into that experience of listening.
Which is quite interesting, and I would like to touch upon something related to that, which is a discussion that I think among many arts venues, or specifically concert venues, orchestras even, has been going on, and it's this idea, or the reality of having to deal with certain social issues that have come up to the surface, and the role of arts with this. When we're talking about what you're describing right now is a pure artistic experience of just listening and getting in everything that the sound provides to you and making your own experience out of that. But that sometimes clashes with the idea that you have to have a role in society, that you have to have an impact in society. And I know by reading some of the stuff you write that you're quite involved with social issues. You just said it yourself. How does that work? How do you negotiate that artistic, musical drive that I think most of us that are working in the music business are driven to, with the outer world, the little musical world with the bigger outer world?
Yeah, I don't think I see them necessarily at odds with each other. I think that, first of all, to provide sort of sensuous experiences has social value. And so, I don't see them at odds in those kinds of pieces, pieces that are sort of these more sensuous experiences. But yes, I do have pieces that deal more directly with social issues. And I think that it's interesting to consider the different kinds of functions that music could have with respect to social issues. And I was just actually with Spektral Quartet talking about this at a conference over this past weekend. So one of the discussions happening at this conference was sort of to the extent to which music is useful or not at raising awareness about issues, or are there other functions that it might perform? And so one thing that I think is very important is writing about social issues, writing music about social issues in ways that either bear witness to something or provide sort of a space for processing the emotions that come with whatever the thing is. And if we want to have a campaign to raise awareness about something, I tend to think that there are sort of more efficient ways to do that than to write music about it. But music can provide a kind of emotional experience that an advertising campaign cannot. And that is really useful. When people feel the emotion of how something affects someone else, then, that they're more likely to change their mind about something or to act on something than if they receive factual information.
I guess we sometimes forget that underlying all these social issues or conflicts, feelings and sentiments are involved. And one of the things that I find through music is that somehow it helps clarify my feelings about something. It brings out this sensibility that I cannot necessarily rationalize, not necessarily explain. But once I see something or feel something, the music can bring it out and can create within a certain audience the ability to listen to each other, listen to the other, and be able to discuss things. In terms of the role of the composer today, how do you see this I
That's
don't
an
know how
interesting
the
question.
social role of the composer today. What's the use of you guys?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I live in the Midwestern United States, and I mostly feel like there's not a whole lot of pressure on me to be anything in particular because contemporary music is like such a small niche of culture. And people are paying way more attention to other kinds of culture, en masse. And so to me, that's very freeing. I sort of feel like, I can be the artist I decide to be. And because there's not this sort of pressure to speak to a mass audience, one can try to find ways to speak that are perhaps more experimental or more effective in a small, specific kind of way, or whatever it is. So, so I'm not feeling very grand about the role of the composer in society right now. But I do feel like just having people who are creating and who are interested in creating, outside of industry-driven norms and pressures. I think that's very valuable. And I'm definitely not like anti-culture industry. Like there's amazing things happening in pop music. But I still think it's important to have spaces that are not driven by some of the same pressures that pop music producers might be driven by.
I think you're right. I mean, it's a freer space because you don't have to sell millions of downloads or tickets or whatever, but and it allows you to explore your own voice and your own being, which kind of goes back to the little guy versus the bigger world. Have you had any experience where audience members of a recital come afterwards and say, this really highlighted something that I had not been conscious about, made me realize something? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, many times. That happens to me a lot. The most beautiful thing I think someone's ever said to me after a concert, somebody said, when I listen to your music, I don't feel like I'm listening to it. I feel like it's listening to me. So I very much appreciated that comment. But also, certainly with my opera about Juana of Castile, which was written in collaboration with 6 women who were incarcerated at the time that we were working on the piece, that got a lot of that kind of feedback. So where, and it was interesting because it came from a number of different kind of groups of people. So people who saw the piece who had been incarcerated or who have relatives who have been incarcerated. A lot of folks told me that they really felt like their experience was represented or that they felt seen in a way that was not typical. And then also just in general, a lot of women who saw that project saw their experience represented. So even if they haven't, been queen turned political prisoner, just the experience of sort of being surrounded by structures that are designed to control you, I think is a pretty common experience. And so that piece, a lot of people really resonated with. And I think it does allow for some of that kind of emotional processing of what it is like to exist within these structures.
Which goes back, and maybe you can talk a little about that. Your attraction towards the written texts. I think there's something in that, and the fact that you do work in opera and musical theater, which is not a very common thing. I must say, I'm trained as a singer, and what I've seen throughout the past years is that the music establishment standing further and further away from from the voice, from the human voice. There's certain, I don't know, angst or difficulty in seeing the sung voice as a vehicle. Now it's not an easy instrument to use today, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think for me, I grew up with the voice being very important in two different ways. So my parents were opera fans, and so there was a lot of opera in my house growing up. But my family is also Quaker, and the Quaker culture in the East Coast of the United States that I grew up in is very connected to the folk music revival of the 1960s and to political movements where communal singing and folk music were a big part of the movement culture. So for me, the voice has always been very important, and I'm not afraid of its directness. Mm-hmm. I think that the directness of the voice can be difficult to work with within some of the aesthetics of contemporary music, because it's there, and if someone sings "I love you," there's nothing nuanced about that. And so I think it can be difficult to sort of to know how to embrace something that speaks so directly within the complex languages of contemporary music. And I find that by sort of embracing that directness, that it's a very sort of beautiful conduit often within the larger textures I create that are sort of more mysterious. If the voice is sort of almost like a sort of guiding lantern, mm-hmm. sort of taking you through that mysterious world.
I love that. I love the way you described it, and you're right. Text can be so direct, and I think that's what makes for the lieder and chansons. It seems cheesy today. I mean, it seems really cheesy, and it's hard to get audiences to relate not only to different languages to begin with, but to a kind of writing that was done in the 19th century or early 20th century. But it is a challenge. I think it is a challenge. Do you work with writers usually, or do you write your own words?
I do write a lot of my own words. I haven't done. I mean, I worked with writers in the sense that the women who co-wrote the opera with me were co-librettists, and they were brilliant scholars and poets. And so for that project, we had a kind of group writing process. But otherwise, I haven't done a lot of working with writers. But right now I'm actually working on a piece where I'm setting poetry by Susan Stewart, who's an American poet. And so I've been corresponding with her about her poetry, and that's been a really nice thing. So I'm enjoying that, and it's making me want to do that more.
What other collaborations do you explore? Do you work with choreographers, theater writers? I mean, of course, you've worked with operas, so stage directors are probably involved. But how are those collaborations, and is there a challenge for contemporary music to work with other aspects? Broadway is so straightforward, opera can be so straightforward, movies can be so straightforward, but contemporary music has this abstract aspect to it that I don't know what are the challenges in working with other more visually driven media.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, at least in my experience, collaborating with people across disciplines has in some ways been easier than, speaking to people who are musicians but who don't know contemporary music. In the sense that I think a lot of the folks I've worked with, in theater or architecture or visual art or poetry, are also thinking in this kind of metaphorical way. And so approaching sound as like a site of many potential meanings, and not necessarily expecting things to sound a certain way. In my experience, these relationships have been very open about what the nature of music and sound could be. So I've really enjoyed that. I've worked, I mentioned sort of a couple of disciplines. Right now I'm involved in a project that also includes Clara Lyon from Spektral Quartet, where we're working with an interdisciplinary team of artists to create a installation performance version of an art book by visual artist Antonia Contro and poet Liz Bradfield. And so that's been a really rich collaboration that has been going for a couple of years now. And I think it's kind of the same as what I was just saying, where we're really able to talk to each other in these metaphorical ways across our disciplines. What becomes challenging is the production infrastructure of these interdisciplinary collaborations. It's sort of a blessing and a curse, because you get to create your own infrastructure, which means you don't have to deal with like the hierarchies of an opera house or what have you, but you also have to create your own infrastructure. So there's more work, and you have to figure out kind of on which discipline's terms is our production going to work.
Mm-hmm. So you've had the challenge to accommodate your music sometimes to the plot, the staging, the lighting, the space, or even the facilities. Are there logistical aspects as well in terms of deciding what, and budgetary aspects, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. I think I've been pretty lucky in most of my interdisciplinary collaborations, in the sense that I sort of entered projects at a point where there was still quite a bit of freedom for what my piece of this would be. So that's been luck. So I haven't honestly had to deal with a lot of restriction. But I like this sort of ongoing collaborative process. I don't think of it as restriction, but where, sort of if the group sort of creates a space, and like all the material sort of passes through that space and is shaped by it. And I don't see that as like a dilution of my instincts. I see it as collaboration, which is a thing I love doing. I see it as a way my instincts are being channeled that is interesting, and I'll discover things I wouldn't have if it was just me.
It's interesting, because the way I always or usually look at these things is in terms of restrictions, of being restricted and having to fight and find myself, finding my voice within this. Yours seems like an easier way to tackle these projects. What are you working on right now? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I have talked to many other people that have a similar feeling about these collaborative processes, that it's sort of more adversarial. But I think, again, I've been very lucky in being able to choose collaborators and choose projects where it doesn't feel that way. So I think who you're working with and getting to sort of construct your own process is a big part of it feeling smooth.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think one of the big challenges of working in a creative field is finding that aspect of collaboration. It's a field that's known for big egos, big ways of seeing things, and sometimes that leads to a lot of inflexibility. How do you negotiate that, or how? I mean, does it have to do with the team? Does it have to do with a leader? Does it have to do with a shared vision? All of the above? Serendipity? I don't know.
Yeah, for me, it's been very important to cultivate ongoing relationships with a small number of ensembles and people who have known my work for now a long time, and who have programmed it over and over, and we continue to work together. So Spektral Quartet is a great example of that. Ensemble Del Niente is also an example of that. So for me, those relationships are very important. And those are relationships where, I know we have a foundation of working together. I know we have trust. And so I'm always really happy to come back to those relationships anytime that's possible. But I see my role in a collaboration as facilitating everybody else doing their best. And, of course I care about the quality of my own work and that it be well represented within the collaboration. But my feeling is generally that will happen if I'm attending to the relationships and if I'm facilitating and supporting for other people. And so there's just sort of a kindness that I try to bring to situations. And I certainly choose when I can to work with people who have a similar approach. Because yes, there are egos in the industry.
And it's not easy. It's not easy to collaborate all the time, and not all people are driven or geared for collaboration necessarily.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think for me, like the perfect collaborator is somebody who has very high standards for themselves artistically, but also has equally much kindness.
Mm-hmm. And I guess respect, the ability to listen, to communicate, to share in a way of moving forward, finding this vision. So we're running a little bit short of time. Let's talk about Spektral Quartet and the String Quartet number 1, which is the quartet we're going to listen to in a few minutes.
So yeah, what can I tell you about it? They've been playing it for a long time.
Well, we were really excited about presenting Spektral Quartet last year because we had been in touch with them for some years now, and we had finally managed to bring them down to Colombia, and we were really happy with the program. It was an all women's composers program, and the pandemic came in and everything went out the window, but we've managed to put something together that I think still keeps some of the spirit of the concert that we wanted to present to our audience. But how did you meet them? What are they known for? Because people in Colombia don't know Spektral Quartet. This would have been their first visit to Colombia, and our audience I know they would have loved them, but they're only going to see them on video in a few minutes. Yeah.
Well, I met Spektral Quartet when I was in graduate school at Northwestern University, and some of their members also went to Northwestern, and so we were all kind of in the same kind of graduate student / young new music professionals world. And so they commissioned this piece for me in 2010, and it was one of their first commissions. And it was, for me, kind of one of my first commissions that is sort of still a piece that's in my catalog that I'm very proud of, that has really influenced a lot of what I've written since. And so it's been 10 years at this point since it was premiered. And in that time, Spektral Quartet has really grown into an organization that is known for being equally good at performing historical music and new music. And they believe in combining those things on their programs. So their programming is often very imaginative, and they'll have great themes for their concerts. And I think they're also known for creating just an environment for their audiences that is welcoming, that is jovial. They'll tell jokes, not too cheesy. Well, sometimes cheesy. They make it fun to be around them, and don't take themselves too seriously. When they're talking with the audience, but take themselves very seriously in the rehearsal room.
I think that's quite important, and maybe as a composer you can talk a little bit about that. The fact that yes, this is an intellectual field, an artistic field with very high standards, but it does not have to be boring or off-putting or cold at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel this very strongly because I am a faculty member at a college that is only undergraduates. And so, I teach students regularly who are young music students. And I feel like particularly the generation that is in school now, it really matters to them that we attend to each other's humanity. Mm-hmm. You know, that if I were to just walk in and lecture and not care about them as people, they would be uninterested in that kind of education. And luckily, I already care about them as people, so I'm not having to change what I do. But I just feel very aware of that as a teacher, that, you know, even when we are working really, really hard at our craft, that the bottom line is, how are we relating to each other? Mm-hmm. You know, what kind of energy are we putting into any space that we're in, whether it's with collaborators, speaking with audiences, working with students, being students. And I think that, I think the music world would be better off if everybody were attending to each other's humanity mm-hmm. as rigorously as we do to our practice.
Yeah, in the end, be it at work, at home, we want to be okay. We don't want to be stressed out about anything. We want to live our lives comfortably, and I think what you mentioned is completely right, and I probably see it as well in the younger generations here in Colombia, of people wanting to have a better convivial way of living their life, you know, of having their existence, which is something us older generations should learn from. Lastly, tell us a little bit about the quartet. You know, what does it characterize in terms of the exploration that you were doing then? And you mentioned that this is a piece that kind of has stayed in your catalog, reflects a lot of the explorations that you carried on through time. How does this piece collect all that?
Yeah. So the string quartet was written at a time when I was really trying to figure out harmony and what I was going to do with harmony. And so it combines aspects of sort of historical tonal harmony with some sort of spectral procedures. And so some of this is very technical, you know, in the sense that, like, I take a harmonic progression and I time stretch it using logarithmic curves so that it appears to speed up and slow down in very sort of extreme ways. And so it sort of comes into focus sometimes, and you might notice, like, oh, there was just a cadence there. What just happened? But many times it's also sort of subsumed because the tempo is so slow that you're not hearing it as having a harmonic rhythm. So those technical aspects that I worked out in that piece are then getting at this sort of more affective thing of this distance from this historical material and the sort of pathos in that distance. So it's not so much, I'm not so much trying to kind of steal some of the pathos of historical harmony, but rather to sort of take the historical harmony as an object, and the pathos is like the pathos of looking at this object through this mist of historical time.
All the things that we just talked about. Exactly. Distance, historical distance. Great. Well, I'm sure we're going to enjoy it, and I'm sure we're going to be listening to more of your pieces in our future seasons. And it will be really nice to meet you sometime if we're done with this pandemic. Actually, I had one last question, because I kind of left it previously. We've had a full year of physical distancing with friends, family, colleagues. Has this permeated somehow what you think about distance and the themes that you have tackled in your music?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer yet. I really don't. I have a number of projects that I'm working on right now that I almost feel, now that you mention it, I almost feel like in these projects, like I'm almost really deliberately avoiding that question. Because I think to
brewing.
Yeah. I think that the answer to that question, like, ask me in 2 years.
You know, my boss asked me at the end of the year, what had we learned? I think we're still learning.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's okay to let ourselves just acknowledge that, like, we're still in it. Mm-hmm. And that those answers may take more time. But yeah, now I'm going to think more about that question. Thank you for asking that. That'll be in my brain.
We'll eventually meet and we'll talk about it.
Yes, I look forward to it.
Well, Eliza, thank you so much. And thank you for being part of our season with your work. Thank you for having this conversation, very candid conversation about many of your thoughts and the ways you write music. So I'd just like to invite everybody to stay tuned and just click on the concert by Spektral Quartet, where we'll be able to listen to Eliza's first string quartet. Thank you all for being here.